Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
The Gospel of Life. I'm your host, Leticia Velasquez. We have as our guest today Nancy Valko, who's been a guest previously, and she will introduce herself. But first, let's start with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. O Mary, bright dawn of the new world, Mother of the living, to you do we entrust the cause of life. Look down, O Mother, upon the vast numbers of babies not allowed to be born, of the poor whose lives are made difficult, of men and women who are victims of brutal violence, of the elderly and sick killed by indifference or out of misguided mercy. Grant that all who believe in your Son may proclaim the gospel of life with honesty and love to the people of our time. Obtain for them the grace to accept that gospel as a gift ever new, a joy of celebrating it with gratitude throughout their lives, and the courage to bear witness to it resolutely in order to build together with people of goodwill a civilization of truth and love to the praise and glory of God, the Creator and Lover of life. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Yesterday was the feast day of Pope St. John Paul II, and he's our inspiration for the show. So I'd love to welcome Nancy Valko, who will do the introductions herself, so for those of you who haven't met her online.
Well, thank you, Leticia. My name's Nancy Valko. I'm in St. Louis, Missouri, and I'm a spokesperson for the National Association of Pro-Life Nurses, and I'm a writer. I used to write for Voices, which is the publication of Women for Faith and Family that unfortunately is no longer around. I was pro-life co-chair under Archbishop May for the St. Louis Archdiocese. I was a reporter for the National Catholic Register. I've been a registered nurse. Next year it'll be 50 years, and I've worked everywhere, oncology, burns, hospice, and probably the most important is I've had myself personal or professional knowledge of every single pro-life issue. I lost a daughter to a suicide using an assisted suicide technique. I had a daughter with Down syndrome and a very severe heart defect where I was given a choice about operating on her, and when I said absolutely, she's to be treated like any other child, she was made a do not resuscitate behind my back.
Oh, it's terrible.
I did get that change. I have had abortion offered to me when my first husband was very ill in the hospital, and I was in my third trimester, and which is why she's named Joy, because that was the best way of getting back at the doctor. And one of my daughters had a teenage pregnancy, and that was very interesting. I've written on that too. So I'm very involved in medical ethics and the whole pro-life community.
Wow, you have had your faith and your belief in pro-life tested in so many ways, and you've come shining through. Undaunted and stronger, haven't you?
Hopefully, but it's kind of more of a sadder but wiser, because I do so much and I travel the country talking about medical ethics issues, particularly at the end of life, and I have just been so disheartened by the difference. Like I will be writing a blog on this at some point, but I was a nurse before abortion was legalized, and it totally changed the medical profession and medical ethics when it happened. When I started, I loved the camaraderie between the nurses and the doctors. At the time, I was working in what is now a level 1 trauma unit, an ICU unit, and it was wonderful. We'd even work after hours on our own time, to help save. We tried to save everybody. When someone was clearly dying, we took care of them, but we did nothing to hasten or cause their death. When abortion came in, it wasn't until later I realized that changed. When it came up in our unit, we were all surprised with Roe versus Wade in 1973, but when I expressed alarm about it, as did other people, we were jumped on immediately by people who said, no, it's a good thing. It's for women.
Oh.
And that was the beginning. But I think what most people don't realize is how it totally changed medical ethics forever, and now we have Canada considering euthanizing children.
Without parent consent. It's terrifying. As the current mother of a daughter with Down syndrome, every time she's sick, I'm on her side so carefully between our family and the the medical professionals. And thank heavens I have an RN as a daughter, and soon to have another RN as a daughter, who can help interpret some of the things going on, because I am terrified that one day a doctor or nurse will take it into their own hands to end my daughter's life, thinking they're doing me a favor.
I have seen that because I had to stand up. At one point, I was a single mother of 3 children at the time, and I refused to do something that was totally unethical, and it was euthanasia. And I went up the chain of command, talked to the surgeon, did everything, but I was threatened with firing later on because I would not do it. And it turns out they were wrong about the patient's diagnosis, that he was absolutely fine.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, how many times have we heard this? That's really something. So I brought you on today to talk about, euthanasia is a topic we can cover, but more currently we're dealing with a film that is Gosnell, which chronicles this story, a true story, of a late-term abortion doctor who was notorious in Philadelphia. Yet, curiously, the media has shown very little interest in his case when he was being tried. He has a life sentence. In the book, when the book came out, which was a bestseller, and in the film, which is literally being suppressed in the theater. So Nancy's written a blog on it, and I want you to talk about who Gosnell is for our public that may not know who he is. Dr. Kermit Gosnell of Philadelphia.
Kermit Gosnell was, interestingly, he started in the abortion movement, and that was one thing I found out from the movie, which I was a little bit worried about watching because I get so emotional about this stuff.
Me too.
But I'm very glad I did.
It wasn't gory, Nancy, was it? The movie.
It was not.
It could have been.
It's a PG-13. I think a high schooler could see it.
Right. It's disturbing, but it's not gory. It's not. There's no gratuitous gore. There's talk of what happened in the clinic, which of course would upset anybody with a conscience. But you don't actually see the images. They protect you from them.
And some people objected to it. I've read a lot of different reviews on it. But it's interesting that Kermit Gosnell, he actually started out, and I had read about this years ago in the early, the early 70s, is he and, turns out, another guy had developed a kind of cutting machine that they thought would just chop up the baby, and then they could get rid of it.
It was like a ball of knives that opened up in the womb and rotated to chop the baby to bits, and somehow these 2 doctors thought it wasn't going to hurt the women. I guess they had their minds. I mean, can you imagine a ball of razors inside your uterus just rotating? They bust women in, right? They bust women into Philadelphia to try it out on them, and of course they were lacerations.
Crazy. And I remember reading about it and didn't connect it until later, but they do mention that in the movie.
It was quite a while ago, right? Maybe the 80s. Am I right?
And he left. It was in the early 70s, and he left for the Bahamas and stayed there for like 10 years before.
That's right. He had to lay low for a while after that one.
Yeah, and then he started this abortion clinic, and which was basically for late-term abortions.
Right.
And it was apparently terrible even from the beginning, and it failed all the inspections. But abortion had become so entrenched politically that he said, well, I'll make it cleaner. And they just accepted that. And finally, the last 17 years, they didn't even go there. And they were told, actually, by the governor, leave the clinic alone. This
Tom Ridge, Republican governor, but pro-abortion, Tom Ridge.
Hard to believe.
Yeah, told him do not go into the clinic despite the various health complaints. And some of them were delivered in person.
And that's one of the most shocking things about it. And he went on for a long time, and finally there was a drug bust done. They had heard about some illegal pain relievers being sold and stuff, and they did a drug bust and found out this girl worked at Gosnell's clinic. So there was a SWAT team that went in, and it was only to find these illegal drugs, and instead what they found was the most filthy, horrible place, unlicensed personnel, preserved baby feet in the refrigerator. It was just a mess, and it was taken to the DA, and these babies were over the legal limit for Pennsylvania,
which is 24 weeks.
24 weeks.
Yeah.
But he would put down whatever. He said it doesn't really make a difference. And he used these unlicensed personnel. But the shocking part,
they were giving anesthesia without even his supervision. Young high school girls, And they had
were
a
as young
color
as 15
chart.
years old.
Yeah,
and
they had a color chart, pink, orange, etc., as to how much drugs should be administered. It's horrifying. And I think several women died, but he was only indicted on the one death.
Well, what they did is apparently the DA, when they found all of this, they took it to the district attorney, who really didn't want to touch it. But an assistant district attorney who was supposedly pro-choice, pro-abortion, she took it because she goes, well, this isn't about abortion, this is about murder.
Right. It's amazing what a few inches in the place where the baby lives, a few inches in the woman's anatomy, all of a sudden what is not murder becomes murder. But the same exact procedures are done.
Mm-hmm.
Of ripping a child to bits or snipping the neck. But as long as it's within the womb, it's perfectly fine. It just blows the mind. But the public needs to see that, because that's reality.
Well, and that snipping of the neck, the spinal cord, they could only charge him for a few babies who were over the legal limit. It wasn't that this was apparently a routine thing, as he induced labor with Cytotec, and then when the babies were born, would snip their necks to cut their spinal cord.
Outside the womb. And these are babies that could live if they were given medical care.
That were living.
Yeah, they were breathing. They were breathing and moving, right.
Yeah, I give the young women who were his unlicensed assistants talked about the babies who were living and all. And it was, they decided to have a trial on it, and because of the abortion laws, they could only have like one or two, and one woman was sedated by an unlicensed technician, and she died, so she was charged with murder in that. But the trial was extremely interesting, and that took up probably most of the movie, along with how strange Dr. Gosnell was and how he had gotten by with so many things. He had his clinic for 30 years. 30 years. And it was just awful, and the filth, and everything was so bad. And as I said in my review, I said, you wonder, could it really have been that bad? At the end, they show the pictures. This thing was absolutely accurate.
Describe it for those who haven't seen the film. Describe what you mean by filth, because I don't think people could comprehend this without.
Oh, there were bags of aborted babies' bodies all over. Nothing had been thrown away. There were the preserved baby feet in the refrigerator. There were cats all over the place, cats who had died. The basement was so bad that they had to wear hazmat to go down there. The place was absolutely...
That was the basement of his house in the show, but there were still cats in his office, in his medical office, defecating, urinating, all over the place. Fleas.
They actually brought in one of his operating tables, and it was...
Oh, right, into courtroom.
That was amazing, it was absolutely awful. There were reused instruments. There was no cleanliness. And then even though he was African American, he put the white women in a different room than the other ones, which was, some guy, I think one person there said, well, that's kind of racist, isn't it?
Yeah, racist, but he's black. It's amazing.
Yeah, the whole thing was just, it made no sense, and no one could have come up with a book about this on their own. I always say true life is much more interesting than fiction. Fiction never can go almost as far as something like this. So the movie, I won't give the ending, but there was a surprise development later in the movie. It seemed to be going against this DA, this young woman district attorney, who was told, your job is on the line. You don't get a conviction. You're gone. So she put her job on the line. And the way they did it was a shocking development at the end. And it turned it around because they said the jury that was listening to it was basically pro-choice, too.
Yeah, the defense attorney wouldn't admit pro-lifers on the jury because, both lawyers get to vote on it. So it was a hostile courtroom that the DA was working with, and it was even judges who threatened her, don't let this be about abortion. You can't prosecute an abortionist, no matter how he flouts the laws. Like you said, that there were non-medical personnel administering anesthesia, the cleanliness, the filth of the place. I mean, we're talking, instruments that were supposed to be single-use instruments that were reused. They weren't sterilized. Blood.
And women got infected. Not only
women got STDs from coming to his place. Yes.
It was terrible, and they had somebody do that. I think one of the most interesting parts of the movie was when they had their expert witness was an abortionist, a lovely lady.
Yeah, very poised, very elegant-looking lady. Yeah. Did not look like someone you'd picture as Gosnell was creepy and scary and odd, but this lady was very put together. You would never see this woman as someone who killed for a living.
And she was there to explain how it's done properly, a late-term abortion. And as she discussed it, it was basically what Gosnell did.
Yeah, exactly.
Just as awful as it, but it was done more in the womb. And they brought out a syringe with a huge needle, how they inject potassium into the heart because they didn't want any babies to live outside the womb. And, of course, we have partial birth abortion where the baby is born, but the head is left in, and then the brain is sucked out through the neck. And very, very similar to Gosnell. And
in order that the head collapses so that by the time the baby exits the birth canal, the baby's dead. See, it's all legalism. That baby has to be dead when the baby exits the womb. Otherwise, it's infanticide. That's why the head must be collapsed by sucking out the brain. It's terrible. It's a machination to make sure that abortion is protected.
But Gosnell did it easier. He just induced labor, had the baby born, and then just snipped the neck as soon as it was born. And in one case, he said, "Boy, this baby's so big, he could walk me to the bus stop."
Horrible. Was that baby A?
Horrible.
I think that was baby A. Am I right?
I think that was baby A.
Baby A is notable because one of the nurses who tended to have she had a photo blog, and she liked to take pictures. I don't even know if she was a nurse, but she was an assistant. She took a picture of the probably still living child or just nearly dead child in the tray. The tray, they put the child on the shelf of the utility room, and that stunning picture was shown to the jury in a moving moment. You don't see it as a viewer of the film, but that was a game changer. The picture of the child that could walk him to the bus stop that he joked about. And what was the reason she gave for taking the picture? That everyone knew that this child lived even for a few moments.
Yes. She was so touched by this child, so at least somebody would know that he was there. And as far as the picture goes, at the very end of the movie, they don't show the picture, but they do give you a link to see the picture.
I've seen it, and I've seen it posted on social media. It's very sad. But if you've been in the pro-life movement, you've seen hundreds like it. But they're not exploiting the fact that they have you as an audience and showing you gore and all that. If you are afraid of that, don't let that keep you from seeing the movie. The truth is very compelling without it. In other words, so many movies in Hollywood, and I get really mad, they're all about computer graphics and explosions, and especially now we're coming up to Halloween. Oh my goodness, you can't turn on the TV without seeing somebody spurting blood or being a rotting corpse. And enough of that. Gosnell is creepy in a sense on its own merits, on the fact that there's a human being out there that would act like this. You don't need all the gore and horror.
You don't. And it's very powerful, and I've seen some pro-life reviewers not like it so much. They thought it should be more hard-hitting. To me, it was hard-hitting in a very subtle way. And what's interesting about it, there were several people who worked on the movie and with the book who were neutral or pro-choice on abortion.
Yes, I think Dean Cain is one of them. He plays the detective.
Yeah, and McElhenney was another one who helped write the book and do the movie, and it really changed minds and hearts. And I think sometimes we are so shocked by it, but we work with people. I know when I talk about abortion, we're working with people that really don't want to think too much about it, and they don't want to be seen as anti-woman, and they know it's like when Roe versus Wade was brought up in our unit, and I got jumped on right away. Mm-hmm. I understood, without knowing the term, I was no longer politically correct.
Right.
And that I had to almost hide my views so as not to be attacked.
Or fired. Or fired.
Oh, really important. In fact, I was on an ethics committee. I never said that I was with the National Association of Pro-Life Nurses. And what I do, I was horrified by some of the stuff I heard when I was on ethics committees in the hospital. And the way I would do it is I would ask questions. Well, if A happens, then B might follow. And it would upset people. But I was able to stop some things. I give a different point of view. I found it very effective for getting the pro-life view out without saying it was. I just went on the basic principles of medical ethics, how things change for people. I've written about it. In one case, they wanted to change the rules at a hospital on brain death. A young doctor had gone out and checked every place in our area, every hospital, and he said, oh, let's pick the least restrictive so we can get more organs. You know, that kind of stuff. And I brought that out. I said, if people know about that, they're not going to sign their organ donor card. People think this is all set in stone. It's not. So you see things like that, but people are so used to it, and I think we have to be very patient with the average person because they don't want to know. They don't really want to think about it.
No, no, and it's our job as pro-life advocates and activists to make them see what they don't want to see. Remember, did you see the film William Wilberforce? It was called Amazing Grace.
No, I didn't see it, but
he was an advocate against the slave trade in Britain, and he had a profound Christian conversion. And what he did was really interesting. He took the Lords, the House of Lords, on a boat ride on the Thames, and I've been on one myself, very elegant with champagne and a string quartet. It wasn't my one, but his was very elegant. Then he pulled up along a slave ship, and the utter horror of the stench, they didn't even go inside. Had anyone seen those diagrams of slave ships, you know how horrible they were. There were no people in it, but the mere stench of death and filth was enough to convince a lot of people. And he did force them to confront it. And we have to do that maybe in not as dramatic a way, but he did change the hearts and minds and stop the British slave trade. But it took him 20 years. It took him a long time. But he needed to help them see what they didn't want to see. And that's why I think Gosnell is facing so much opposition. I want to talk about that today. First of all, the trial was not attended by hardly any journalists at all. There was, I believe, one local journalist who took pictures of bench after bench reserved for press with nobody in them. Do you remember that during the trial, Nancy?
Oh, I remember that because I thought, why is this not a bigger story? And the only ones who really covered it well and actually had a special on it was Fox News.
That's right.
Everybody
and the national papers and the national networks were saying it's a local story because they were trying to suppress it. So only Fox, I remember Fox covered it, but nobody else, until one of the journalists sent that picture onto Twitter, and it picked up speed with a lot of our favorite pro-life tweeters, and they called a Twitter storm. And a Twitter storm is when everyone decides at 2 o'clock on a Friday, we're all going to tweet the hashtag Gosnell, or whatever it would be. And what we do is we make it rise in the ratings so that it trends. And Gosnell started trending. And what happened is CNN, USA Today, Los Angeles Times, New York Times all got embarrassed into covering it because it became an issue by a sheer force of the will of the people. And they sent their representatives to sit in the courtroom, and then it became a national story. But it wasn't until activists worked on it. And it was one journalist. In the movie, they show her as a blogger. She's sort of a conglomeration of several true characters. But everything in the movie's true. It's just sometimes they merge characters to make things work better on film. But everything is true. There was like a lone voice or two standing up and saying, somebody should witness this. This is horrific. Even if you believe in abortion, you certainly don't want a clinic like this to allow it standing or women to die. As that woman, I believe she was from Nepal or Bangladesh, that she died.
Yeah.
In his
clinic. It's so sad
she was over-medicated.
You think all these things that come out, you think, okay, this will do it.
Yeah.
I remember when I was in the pro-life movement, I kept saying, oh, well, that'll do it. And when partial birth abortion came out, I said, oh, my God, this will do it. And
I think we want a quick reversal, but you know what? I think partial birth abortion started to turn the tide because, abortion has gone down to half of what it was in the 80s and early 90s. And that's about the time
because of contraception, but it's not. But
No. I think it's partially that partial birth abortion shocked America, partially, And I think crisis pregnancy centers are doing such a great job. There's 3 times as many of them as there are abortion clinics. And I remember when we were struggling to be even numbers. So abortion clinics are closing, crisis pregnancy centers are open, and we passed laws, over 300 local laws in the state saying, waiting period, parental notification. In other words, slow down and think about what you're doing. Do you really know? It's really informed consent, right? Do you know what you're doing? So, yeah, the tide is turning, but unfortunately it's not going to be this will wake them up. I wish it were that easy.
There isn't. Well, you know what I finally thought would wake them up is when people would realize they were being lied to, particularly with the partial birth abortion thing. Yep. And it takes more and more stuff to kind of get through, but I think it is getting through, and I'm so glad.
It is. I agree with you. But it's been 50 years, just like slavery was around for hundreds of years. In fact, it's still around in some. So it took a lot to wake up the American people then, and it will again.
Well, and Planned Parenthood is already making plans for a post-Roe versus Wade world.
Right. Yep.
Which is interesting because they're kind of seeing some of the handwriting in the wall, particularly with the latest Supreme Court justice.
Right. And it will not end abortion. We have to make this clear. It will only throw it back to the states. And so there will always be some states that want abortion. Like I think Massachusetts changed their constitution to include a right to abortion, so that should Roe be overturned, they will be, quote, protected. And I'm sure Connecticut has similar provisions where I live. But in the meantime, Gosnell could be a really good wake-up call. And the media, not only they suppress information about the trial, and by the way, it was liberal Catholic Kirsten Powers who wrote a wonderful op-ed on Gosnell at USA Today that helped turn the tide. And she's a Catholic, but she leans left. She's not necessarily pro-life, but even she found this unconscionable. So she helped because she said this is beyond, beyond the pale. So she did it. But then, by the way, the authors of the book, Gosnell, The Story of America's Biggest Serial Killer, are Irish, an Irish couple. Help me remember the names. It's McElhinney and
I'm trying to think of the other one.
Yeah, they're married, but they have different last names. They were not pro-life either. They were covering fracking in Pennsylvania and said, "Oh, this is an interesting trial," and they didn't get the memo that pro-abort people shouldn't attend, and they attended and they were outraged, as they should be. Probably because they don't have abortion in Ireland. They didn't at the time.
Yeah, and this McElhinney, she wrote about it. It was before Ireland voted against the constitutional provision protecting unborn babies, and she said, "I hope this doesn't happen," but it did, and that was a real shock because that was the only pro-life country that I know of in the world that did protect babies. But Roe versus Wade is under, legally, it's just doesn't hold up at all. And that was one of the things that got me in the pro-life movement was I read it. I also have a certification as an advanced legal nurse consultant, and I've always been interested in the law, and that really opened my eyes when I read what the law was and read Robert Bork's book, and that really opened my eyes. I had no idea how.
Which book? Was it Slouching Toward Gomorrah, that one, or was there another one?
Well, there was one, Aborting America.
Aborting America, right.
Was one. I think he did it. I still have the book somewhere. And it really kind of opened my eyes, and it was something I hadn't thought about. And since then, I've gone into it a little bit more deeply. And they actually say in Roe versus Wade, well, if it can be proven that life begins, earlier than birth, it would upset the whole thing, the whole Roe versus Wade justification for abortion.
Well, there is a case, I was recently talking to directors of the Bioethics Defense Fund, Nick Nickus and Dorinda Bordley, and Mrs. Bordley said that there was a case down south, I believe it was the one in Alabama, that could go to the Supreme Court and they were hoping to overturn Roe versus Wade, which said that life begins at conception. So we do have something like that in the works, and we have the Supreme Court we wanted set up. So we'll see what happens. But that would be the fight of the century. You think Kavanaugh was a fight? Whew.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's abortion itself. We used to know. I remember growing up where you couldn't mention abortion in polite company. It was considered a bad word. And to me, it's just so unbelievable. But abortion has not made us any kinder and gentler. It has not made babies more valued or anything. It has really helped to destroy a lot of our culture because of this.
Oh, yeah. Dr. Janet Smith talks about contraception doing that in her famous talk, Contraception, Why Not? And abortion is an extension of contraception. Abortion and contraception are saying, this child is not welcome in my life. And what she said is it was supposed to overcome child abuse. It was supposed to help marriages. It's supposed to overcome poverty, being able to decide when and where you're going to have a child. And all these things have increased. Child abuse, child sexual abuse, spousal abuse, partner abuse, all these things have increased, and we've become, like you said, now we're considering euthanasia of children in Toronto. It's just terrifying how our respect for life has sharply declined. So that countries like Iceland are bragging that they won't have children with Down syndrome anymore. I mean, this would be unthinkable before abortion. Yeah. Unthinkable.
It has, and I said, you think of the kind of crazy mentality that celebrates the Special Olympics with people who have disabilities.
Right. And
on the other side, they want to abort children if they find out they have this disability ahead of time. Anytime in pregnancy. I mean, how do you do that? How do you celebrate one and want them dead in the other? It's really caused a lot of problems. And I think now with so many things that come up is the way they're portrayed is done to make them think a certain way. And we're just telling the truth. This is what happened. And I remember when the pro-lifers with Roe versus Wade, they said if you allow abortion to be legalized, it will lead to infanticide and euthanasia. And I was one.
And they called us crazy. We're
well, I thought it was crazy until I looked into it, and then
because they told us it would avoid things like that, because every single child that's born will be wanted and loved, and everything would just be perfect. And on its face, it didn't sound unreasonable. If we could only choose when and where to have kids, there would be no more need for all these things. And unfortunately, that was wrong, very wrong.
And contraception, I was told, my husband and I were told by a priest, oh, yeah, that's okay, because we were confused by everything we were reading. So we thought, well, we'll pick a priest, and he'll give us the right answer. And he said, well, I think in your circumstances, we were getting married. He said, I think that would be fine. It's an ideal you can strive for. And we went, okay, but I didn't feel right about it. And then, because I didn't know that much about it, and it was bothering me more and more, and I didn't realize I was having side effects from the pill. They didn't tell us that. They didn't tell us it could cause abortion of the baby. It didn't, getting rid of the baby. They didn't tell me about depression and stuff like that. It wasn't until I got off of it that I understood. But what changed my mind is I actually went and read Humanae Vitae, and I thought, how dumb is that? I'm a cradle Catholic. And we went to a priest instead of actually reading Humanae Vitae.
Well, people think those encyclicals are too hard to understand, but first of all, it's 67 pages. I know a couple that have it in their bathroom for their guests that come, so they have something to read. That's short.
It's a beautiful document.
And it reads very easily, and it makes a lot of sense, especially 50 years later. All the things that St. Pope Paul VI predicted are coming true. But back to Gosnell, we were predicted that human life and women would be would decrease in value, and that women would be exploited. And there is nothing pro-life about or pro-woman what Dr. Gosnell did to women. That's one of the quotes from the film. There's nothing pro-women about having a filthy clinic, about having separate waiting rooms for women of color, about having untrained teenagers handing out lethal drugs, potential lethal drugs. And let's talk about Dr. Gosnell's cavalier attitude. He had more care for the rare turtles that he kept in a cage in his filthy office. He brought them, special food. And when he was undergoing trial and was in prison, what was his concern? I want those turtles protected. So the turtles had to be cared for. But the babies...
and the district attorney said, you must do, when they went to the district
right.
attorney.
You must protect those endangered turtles. Don't you have any concern for nature? And she was presiding over a trial where babies were killed without anesthesia, born babies. And women were left to die of hemorrhaging. And when they tried to get this woman that died out, the EMTs finally came after he delayed, calling them, They couldn't get the stretcher through the warren of offices. There weren't elevators. Doors were chained shut. They couldn't get her out of the clinic in time to save her life. And talk about being anti-women. Any medical clinic, and I've been looking into running one, a pro-life medical clinic, you have to have handicapped access. You have to have wide doorways for handicapped. There's all kinds of regulations. But again, Kermit Gosnell was allowed to run around these different medical clinic inspection standards.
And every single protection that's brought up, medically for these abortion clinics is fought tooth and nail. They go, it's going to discourage women. It's not necessary. It's the safest thing in the world. It's like having your tonsils out, which it isn't. It really
in Texas, there was a case that went to the Supreme Court of the United States about doctors having medical admitting privileges in a hospital. We had a case in an abortion clinic in Hartford. We had a pregnancy center next door, and there was a woman brought out hemorrhaging, and her doctor, who had caused the hemorrhage, couldn't travel 1 block to the Hartford Hospital to treat her. So whoever was treating her at the other end had no idea what he was doing. They could have had a conversation on the phone. We don't know. But that's not enough. It might not have been in time to save her life, and because of HIPAA, we'll never know. But that girl might have died because that doctor didn't have medical admitting privileges a block away.
And in Missouri, we were one of the first ones to pass a thing that the abortionist had to have privileges at a local hospital. And they said, fine. They went along with that. And then we found out the big abortionist in Missouri was caught, and he says, I do have medical privileges in Peru.
Okay, so do the work in Peru. By the way, the victim,
they know.
It's horrible. They have no respect for human life, and they don't respect their patients. Anyone who thinks they do is not doing the research. The victim, I just looked up her name, was Karnamaya Mangor. She died and she died because she was hemorrhaging and they couldn't get her out in time. And Gosnell waited for a very long time to make the decision that she should be transported to a hospital. Why? Because it makes them look bad, right?
Well, and one thing that has helped, for years I thought, man, are we getting anywhere, turning things around? And being this far past it, over 40 years, the pro-life laws that have been passed have really opened the eyes of some people. It's almost like prying them open. And with Gosnell, we actually have a bill now in the Senate that would help. I knew this, but I met Nurse Jill Stanek, who in 1999 was shocked to find a live baby boy left to die after an induced labor abortion in a dirty pan. And she held the baby till he died. There was nothing they could do.
Oh, that little baby had Down syndrome, am I right? I read her test. I saw her. It was heartbreaking.
And then there were others. She found out it was
She wanted someone to love him before he died of probably asphyxiation, right, Nancy? You're the nurse. So this little baby boy was gasping for air. And that's an interesting point because the nurse, the doctor who was brought on the trial in the movie Gosnell, said that, maybe snipping the baby's necks after they were born was more compassionate than letting them die slowly of asphyxiation. No, what was would be more compassionate is letting them live until term and giving them up for adoption. But she was actually there to make the case that maybe Gosnell was compassionate ending the life in such a brutal but quick manner. Wow, that's disgusting that we even have to talk like that in our courtrooms.
And it's done a lot. Jill found out it happened a lot in her hospital in Illinois, which ironically was named Christ Hospital.
Wow.
And she pushed it, and her and some other people helped, and they did get the 2002 Born Alive Infants Protection Act, which would give legal protection to these infants. At the same time, it wasn't just this. Baby too, is I got to hear some of the abortion survivors, and I got to hear them in person, and they've gone out and they talked about how they could have died if someone hadn't done something for them, and they were supposed to be aborted. The problem with
they had to break the rules, like in the case of who am I thinking of? Yeah, the nurse had to go and break the rules because you're not. Well, now I believe there's legislation saying you're supposed to help a baby born alive. Wasn't that passed by Congress a while back?
The Born Alive Infant Protection Act passed in 2002 was good, but it didn't have any legal enforcement in it. I read it. It was very, sparse. So they came up with the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, and it passed the House this year in January. And it not only requires physician and abortion facilities to afford the same degree of care to a baby born alive during an abortion that would apply to any other child born alive at the same gestational age, including transportation to a hospital, but it also mandates fines and the possibility of imprisonment for medical professionals who don't follow the law. And it was passed resoundingly in the House. It's now in the Senate. Unfortunately, and this is why the midterms, another reason why the midterms are so important, bills can be passed by a simple majority. However, there's the possibility of a filibuster, so it may need 60 votes in that case to pass the U.S. Senate.
And there's only 51 Republicans, and these things are usually determined down party lines. So we are lacking 9 votes.
And President Trump said he will sign it. So it really is important that pro-lifers, pro-lifers are often asked, why are you single issue? I said, we're single the most important issue.
You know what I always say to them? When Hitler was Chancellor of Germany, he improved the economy. Okay? So why didn't people vote or judge Hitler based on the economic improvement? Because he was a monster and he promoted murder. All right. When there is murder and there's issues like slavery, no one was against America voting on the lines of slavery, or even having a civil war about slavery. It's seen as noble. When you're talking life and death, you really shouldn't be concerned about lesser things. And let's face it, everything's lesser when you're talking life and death.
Yeah, and that is absolutely the truth. And Hitler was one of the first ones to pass euthanasia laws in 1939.
Yep, against the mentally ill and the mentally retarded, as they used to call our children. They were killed by whom? By doctors and nurses in institutions. They would do a plus or a minus next to their name under the T4 program.
On my blog, I did a review of a book called Nurses and Midwives in Nazi Germany, the Euthanasia Programs, and it was stunning. It was a book that really bothered me. I thought I knew a lot. I didn't know. And it was based on eugenics, which actually started in the United States.
Yep.
And spread to Germany, where it was taken totally literally.
To its logical conclusion. Because we were mostly sterilizing minorities and those with disabilities, saying that, as the famous Buck versus Bell case said, that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So we were determining that certain people weren't worthy of reproduction, and the Nazis started with that, and then they went to a logical conclusion. Why are we even feeding these people? They call them useless eaters. The kids who do math problems in school, and how many people in an institution, how much does it cost to feed them versus how many soldiers we could have in the field? And let's face it, soldiers are the most useful members of society because they promote the fatherland and they promote this agenda, the Nazi agenda. So it was inculcated into the brains that some people are worth living and some people aren't. And we certainly have that mentality in the United States when we talk about physician-assisted suicide and abortion. And
I'm of an age now where they talk about it even more, is quality years of life, and we should be talking health span instead of life span.
Don't they give people a rating, QALY, quality of life years? QALY,
they give a rating based on their age. And
I hate to know what mine is, Nancy, because I have diabetes. That lowers my rating.
And they talk about Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel, one of the principal architects of Obamacare, talked about and wrote an article not too long ago is why I want to die at 75. And he says,
let's ask him that the night before his birthday.
Yeah.
If he still thinks that's a cool idea.
He was 57 at the time. And
I'm almost 57, and I think I'm not going to limit God to how many years I should.
He said, past that age, I'm not going to have any vaccinations, I'm not going to have any testing done, and all that stuff. And I thought, how silly are you? They talk about, if you're doing well and they talk about kidney transplants. And I remember they said, in the beginning with kidney transplants, it really was only for the younger people. I started in dialysis so I could go back to school because it was a day job. And I remember we were doing 72-year-old people. And it was not like that. In fact, we were horrified when we found out that the Soviet Union cut people off from dialysis or kidney transplants at the age of 70. We go, well, that's just wrong.
My grandma was in her 80s and was getting dialysis, and we found out that in Great Britain, who had socialized medicine, that would have been denied her under the National Health Plan, and she would have to pay. And I believe the cutoff age was 50. I could be wrong. Dr. William Mobley is a researcher in the field of Down syndrome. And how he became a researcher is he was a resident, and he diagnosed a patient in the ER. She had Down syndrome, and she had acute flank pain, and he accurately diagnosed her as having appendicitis. Well, he came back on shift 12 hours later, and this young woman was suffering intensely. And as you know, appendicitis is very acute and can be life-threatening. And when he asked why she wasn't operated on, was he wrong? And they said, no, you're right, she has appendicitis. He said, well, why aren't you operating on her? Because she has Down syndrome. And he was horrified that they were going to let this young woman die in agony because she had too many chromosomes. So, yeah, this is done in our hospitals regularly.
Well, in a nursing journal, and I protested this, and they got rid of it. They had the ethicist. This nurse ethicist was responding to questions, and they had a young girl with mental retardation who was recovering, but all of a sudden choked on some food in the hospital. And the new nurse ran out to get the head nurse and said, what should we do? And she said, do not resuscitate. Let's just stay with her and hold her hand.
As she gasped for air. Oh, my goodness.
The ethicist said, well, that was the right thing to do. I was furious. I wrote this I got out of the American Nurses Association over this. I tried to change things with them. But I said, this is absolutely ridiculous, choking on a piece of food. This is just how crazy it's got, because she had a do not resuscitate. And I have found that happen in other places. I was told one time with a young boy who was in to get a gallbladder surgery the next day, they said, well, he's got a DNR, so if he falls down in the hallway, don't do anything.
Oh, wow.
I said, this is crazy. And people don't know this. This is why I write my blog, is telling people what they need to know. I help a lot of people who have problems. It just was a 95-year-old lady who fell and fractured her hip that I take to church once a week and out to Chick-fil-A. And she fell and fractured her hip, and they, do you want her a DNR? And the family goes, no. And then she had a blood clot that went to her lungs, and no. And then she wound up with pneumonia, and I was there in the emergency room with her, and the doctor asked me, how aggressive do you want us to be? I said, ask her, because she knew what she was doing. He said, really? She's 95. I said, ask her. And she goes, yeah. And he said, so you want us to do CPR and put all of our body weight on your chest and probably break your bones? And she goes, yeah. That's how, and she recuperated fully. I still take her to church, and she celebrated her 96th birthday. But this is the kind of mentality that we have. But it started with abortion. We need to rethink. Like what I love is with that book written by these nurses about Nazis and midwives in Nazi Germany, they were so horrified, and I think the world was horrified too. But what they did is they started an experimental education program for students where they learned the history of the Nazis. They learned what happened and how it came about and eugenics and all that. But they're non-directed, and they said it gets back to teaching ethics as Nazis being the worst-case scenario, and let's explore those issues. And they said several of the girls changed their minds on abortion and a lot of other things. It was getting back to basics, because ethics now is not about not causing death, or now they talk about not impeding death. And now they even have lethal injections in Canada.
Yeah.
You know, the whole thing has gotten so crazy that we need to get back to that respect for every individual human life.
Right. And that doesn't mean that we have to do every possible medical treatment. You know, when my mother had terminal cancer, at one point it was decided that chemotherapy was a burden to her. And she died 3 months later, as expected. She had chemo, and then she decided, no, it's too much. And that is an ethical choice. That's not impeding death in a true sense, all right? Because her cancer was inoperable. That's different than somebody who lets her die, wants her to die quickly, and accelerates death. We're all going to die. I mean, that's just a fact, right?
now we have assisted suicide because we don't want to take care of the terminally ill. I loved being a hospice nurse. I did it in the hospital and outside the hospital. At one point, I was offered the directorship of an outpatient hospice, and I turned it down. And the reason is because the Hospice Nursing Journal said we've got to they wanted to get away from the usual principle of we neither hasten nor prolong dying. We help people live as well as possible until death. Mm-hmm. She said it's really about autonomy, the patient's choice. And I thought, oh my God, I saw little inklings of it.
Yeah.
When I was working, and one of my patients, who was not near death or anything, but was reading a book about nurses who kill their patients because they felt sorry for them. And she looked at me and she goes, what side are you on? I said, I'm against that. That's wrong and everything else. And she was one of my healthy patients I was just drawing blood work on. And she looked so relieved, and I told the head of our company about it, and she said, you shouldn't have said that. We can't take sides. I said, it's illegal in Missouri. What are you talking about? Wow. Oh, no, you can't talk about that. And I thought, uh-oh. And that's why I didn't take the position as director.
Well, and it's a shame that ethical people are afraid. The medical ethicist at my mother's hospital didn't want, she had her lung nicked in a procedure and she was suffocating, and he didn't want her to have any assistance with that. Yes, she was dying, but as we said, not today. We choose to have this procedure done, and my mother had plenty of time. You know what was important to her? Seeing her brother and sister who lived across the country, that they were elderly, and it took them a couple of months to arrange travel arrangements that were comfortable for them. The day she died, she saw her brother, whom she hadn't seen in years. She wanted that. She wanted a chance to receive the sacraments. She wanted a chance to tell her family how much she loved them and make arrangements. This is all part of what we call as Catholics a good death, a happy death. And she died with her family around her at the hour of mercy on a Friday. It was perfect. There is something as a good death, and being hastened to death is not the way we want to do it, and certainly not dying in a filthy abortion clinic. So one more point I want to make about Gosnell, we only have a few minutes left, is that not only was the trial suppressed, but the film is being suppressed. They made the film 2 years ago, the authors of the book, and it was suppressed. They only got, I believe, 767 theaters, which is a very limited release. But pro-lifers showed up en masse, and we made it one of the top 10 films in the country that week, and the top indie film of independent film released that week. So naturally, the number of film theaters expanded, but not as much as it should have, because some theaters, although Gosnell was selling well, dropped it. My guess is that there was pressure from pro-abortion activists. They don't want us to know the truth. And as Catholics, we believe, and Christians, the truth will set you free. America deserves to know the truth about abortion. And not just about Gosnell. He's not an outlier, Nancy, is he? There are many, many late-term abortionists that, like Tiller, like George Tiller, like, who's the one in Maryland? I just forgot his name.
Leroy Carhart.
Leroy Carhart. He used to work with Tiller in Wichita, but he moved to Maryland. There's many, many late-term abortion doctors that do the exact same thing, where children are born into toilets and drown. Now, if a young woman did this during the prom, I remember a few years ago, she gave birth into a toilet, drowned the child, threw him in the garbage, and went back to the prom. She was arrested. She was convicted, I believe, of manslaughter. But you can do that with a child a couple months earlier, legally, and that's legal, and it's done routinely. There was a testimony of a young woman on the O'Reilly Factor a few years ago, I remember that, who had her child in the toilet at Tiller's facility. So it's not unusual. It is the reality of abortion that it is a brutal procedure. It's often done by men and women who have lost their license, don't have a license in this country, have been reprimanded by the medical community, and are on the lam from the law. And
there's so many people wanting to adopt. We have people in my family that are looking at in vitro fertilization.
Oh, sure.
I have one person I'm very close to in my family. They would adopt any child of any age, with or without any disability. They'd love to have someone with Down syndrome. They said they'd be particularly interested in that. But they're aborting the babies. The thing is it's not like if you have to raise a child yourself. There's actually waiting lists of prospective adoptive parents of children with Down syndrome.
That's right.
There is no reason that you have to do that. Adoption is a wonderful thing. It really helps. But I know when my daughter was pregnant, she had pro-choice friends, and she said, I'm not having an abortion. And they go, okay, we support that with you. And then she said, but I may do adoption. And they all jumped on her and said, how could you give your baby up? It was a horrible thing.
Yeah, I hear that a lot working in the pregnancy center, that I could never do that to my baby. And I think what it really means is I could never do it to myself, because there's a certain sadness in giving up a child. That is a sacrifice. But what they don't realize is that there's a lot of sadness with abortion. They think they're going to be able to walk away because they've been told they can and forget it. But it's not that simple. I know women 20, 30, 40, 50 years after the abortion are still suffering tremendous guilt and pain. They see a child crying, or it's Mother's Day, or they see a pregnant woman, and they're traumatized all over again. Abortion is not a solution to anybody's dilemma. It is terrible. Even if it's not a horrific late term, even if it's an earlier term, it's still horrible.
And it stays with people, and it's something once they get past the first feeling of, oh, I don't have to think about it anymore, they can think about nothing else. And I took care of a woman who kind of fell apart at the end of her life because her belly swelled up. And she was really mean. I was the last nurse that they'd run out of nurses to take care of her because she was so mean. I said, oh, I like those. And she had this huge belly because of her condition. And once I got to know her a little bit, she started crying, and she said, look at my belly. I look like I'm 9 months pregnant. I said, I know this is so hard on you. She says, no, you don't understand. I had an abortion 60 years ago. This is the way God's punishing me. And the reason I'm alive, I'm afraid to die because I know it's the unforgivable sin.
I what
told
a
her about
shame.
Project Rachel.
Good for you. Thank God. You see, if you didn't have this difficult woman, she could have died in despair. How horrible.
Yes. I was so glad to have had her, and everybody goes, how do you put up with her? And I go, I like the hard ones. I said, it's easy to take care of people that always say thank you, but the hard ones are the ones I want. I said, that's where the real reward is, because we're there no matter what. Even if we're not preaching to them or anything else, just by being with them, and I have seen some miraculous things come out of that.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, I often think that the women that are so angry about abortion are the ones that are suffering post-abortion trauma, and they may not even be aware of it themselves. I knew a woman who suffered post-abortion trauma because her sibling was aborted, and she always felt insecure with her mother, am I good enough? Because she thinks in her mind, it could have been me. So we have no idea. And the men who didn't want their women to have abortions, so the abortion caused a wide swath of pain through our society. I think one day when we'll wake up and be shocked to how much damage was done, those 60 million babies that were lost, and every one of them precious to God as you and I. So I want to thank you for coming on today, Nancy. It's as always, it's been a pleasure. We're going to have you back a lot. Nancy's just a wealth of information. We want to encourage you to go and see the movie Gosnell. You can bring your teenagers. Think of what your teenagers see on TV. This is nothing compared to that. And as we're talking about the Youth Synod in Rome, wrapping up today, it's very important to remember young people need a cause, need something to sacrifice for. You ever see how many young people are vegans or are willing to do all kinds of things for the homeless or for the environment? Well, when I was 13, my CCD teacher told me about abortion, and Roe versus Wade had just happened the year before. I just got a $100 check from her. I hate to tell you how many years later it is, over 40. To run my new pregnancy center. She's still praying outside of Planned Parenthood, but she started me down the path as a young person having a cause that I could sacrifice for and that I could dedicate my life to. So we owe it to our young people to open their eyes to what abortion is. Because let's face it, it's their friends having the abortions, not my friends. They're too old for it, but their friends. So we need to educate our young people. So offer to take teenagers or your youth group to see Gosnell. I think it will change their lives and give them a reason to help change the culture for a culture of life. Don't you think, Nancy?
Absolutely. It gives them hope. Like I said, the pro-life message is not one of don't do this and don't do that. It's about the beauty of life and how wonderful things can happen, even out of very tragic situations. So I think it's a very positive message that they need.
Well, look at what a bunch of bloggers and their home computers did. We changed society. I was just reading an article on The Atlantic, a left-leaning intellectual journal, saying, why are we ignoring this child? This is horrific, and this is not someone who supports the right to life. So we can change the culture, and media is a very important means, as you know, especially film. okay, because it doesn't require much effort. You get there and you watch the film, and I think it can change hearts and minds. This can be the Uncle Tom's Cabin of the pro-life movement that starts turning the tide. I think the tide's been turned already, but it'll accelerate the turning of the tide. It may not be the magic bullet that we're all hoping for, because we want abortion to end yesterday, but I think it'll wake up a lot of people, which is why the press refused to do reviews. There were only 7 reviews of Gosnell by the press when they had 80-something reviews of some of the lesser important films that came out that week. 7 versus 82. It's ridiculous. So thank you for your review of Gosnell. Everyone go see Gosnell, and you can write on my Living the Gospel of Life show page at WCAT and tell me what you thought about it. Thank you, Nancy, for coming on. We'll have you back soon. And God bless you for
Leticia.
what you do for life.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.